It's 2022, and the far-right Texas Republican Party want their state to potentially leave the United States. Some old wounds never fully close, and American politics are perhaps the most dangerously divided they've ever been. In the same platform where the Texas Republican Party called for a secession vote, they also called the 2020 presidential election a sham. These are clearly people upset about being part of the US and its long-standing institutions. But as it turns out, Texas potentially leaving the US isn't as simple as a vote, unlike, say, the UK leaving the EU.
The British people have voted to leave the European Union, and their will must be respected.
There is no mechanism in place for a US state to leave the country. If Texas tries to secede, that means war. And even if it manages to somehow make it back to an independent country, the modern facts of geography and politics are not on its side. So let's play this out. What happens if Texas secedes? On this map of Texas, several things really define the Lone Star State. Lengthwise and widthwise, it's over 1,200 kilometers, second only in size to Alaska. It covers forests, plains, rolling hills, deserts, and even mountains. It was once home to a wide variety of native peoples, and in the past several centuries has seen the rise of sizable immigrant populations. There is a reason there's an entire type of Mexican-American fusion food called Tex-Mex. Texas has also been home to a variety of important people, such as Jamie.
Oh hey, that's me.
Who grew up there and researched this video. On one side, it borders the Gulf of Mexico. On three other sides, namely southern Oklahoma, Louisiana, a tiny bit of Arkansas, and Mexico, its borders are along rivers, providing a nice natural divide with these neighbors. And of course, with the Oklahoma Panhandle and with all of its border with New Mexico, Texas is defined by what's called the Pierce Line. North America looked quite different nearly 200 years ago. Canada was still definitely a British colony. Mexico had most of what is now the American West and Southwest, and in 1836, the Republic of Texas was formed after a 1 year-ish long war of independence. You know, remember the Alamo and all that. The Republic, now free of Mexico, was formally recognized as only having about half of what currently makes up modern Texas. Though the government of the fledgling nation claimed lands as far north as modern Wyoming, the Republic of Texas was also very poorly financially managed. It only lasted 9 years. Most of those who fought in the Texas Revolution had been settlers who had moved from the US, but this was probably helped along by the government of Texas taking on a ton of debt, especially in the wake of the revolution. Despite issuing their own currency, within a couple of years, it was virtually worthless. As part of the deal for Texas to join the US as a dependent state in 1845, the US government agreed to assume all of Texas's unpaid debt. In exchange, in part, for Texas giving up millions of acres of land for future states and territories. Even despite this, at the time it was the largest state in the country, as Alaska was still part of Russia. And then, in 1861, Texas held a vote to secede from the US. This was at the start of the American Civil War. But though every other state in the pro-slavery Confederate States of America had their secession declared by legislators, Texas was the one state that held a formal vote on whether or not to leave the US. And they did leave. And Jamie wants me to note that yes, despite what is taught in schools in Texas, the Civil War had everything to do with slavery. And yes, the slavery that was going on in the American South was brutal and horrendous, and was not simply involuntary relocation, like what is recently being proposed to be taught in Texan schools. But back to the topic on hand, one other thing that I've got to stress about history is that post-Civil War Texas was forced to go through Reconstruction. It didn't matter that Texas voted to leave the United States, there is no formal way for the state to leave the US. The best way to understand this is how the US is divided. The reason the UK could vote on leaving the EU, or Quebec could vote on leaving Canada, is based on how these sovereignties are seen. It doesn't matter what pros and cons of any of these situations are, the fact is that Canadian provinces, or EU member states are seen as states that make up a nation, a group of smaller territories that make up a bigger unit. In the US, things are viewed the opposite way. In the simplest terms, on paper, they're instead viewed as small territories that have been carved out of a bigger entity. This is a huge simplification, but there is a popular myth in Texas that due to its status as a once independent country, Texas at any point could just get up and leave the US. Whether any state can do this, or this is a so-called Texas rule, varies depending on who is recounting the myth. But it's just that, a myth, an urban legend, simply not true. And yet, it seems that every few election cycles, the idea of Texas secession is floated to some degree. Most notably, former Governor Rick Perry, perhaps most famous for comparing Donald Trump to Jesus Christ, brought up the possibility of secession whilst campaigning in 2009. However, in Texas itself, the possibility of seceding always was seen as a dangerous fringe idea, one that had little probability of gaining any real traction until recently. According to Richard Albert in a recent interview with Newsweek, the secession vote is nothing more than political posturing and not a real policy proposal. In the same interview, he notably referenced the US Supreme Court case Texas versus White in 1868, a ruling that cemented that states have no formal right to secede. But in the seemingly unstable times of 2020, anything seems possible. And even if secession itself is unpopular, recent trends show that policies in Texas often ignore public opinion, even at the cost of suppressing democratic institutions. So let's say a debatably fair referendum is had on secession and Texas cuts ties with the US and sets off on its own. Richard Albert said that this would mean war. This is not a battle Texas could win. Let's look at some logistics. First off, there is already a sizable US military presence in Texas, particularly on bases such as Fort Bliss and Fort Hood. Even if military members defected to the Texan side, they would be cut off from supplies from the US, and the bases would still be considered US military property. However, aiding Texas here would be its energy capacity. Texas is an oil and natural gas powerhouse, the largest producer in the US, and the flat deserts to the western side of the state are also home to vast wind farms. Though Texas is vast, it would also be surrounded on three sides by the very country it is trying to leave. It's unlikely they would receive any aid from Mexico, and it's very likely that the US Navy would form a blockade in the Gulf of Mexico if they deemed it necessary. This isn't even to mention the humanitarian crisis that could potentially arise. On one hand, the rise in energy and tech companies situated in Texas has led to a massive influx of people moving into the state over the past several years, particularly in cities such as Houston, Dallas, and Austin. However, highly unpopular policies such as voting rights crackdowns, attacks on the rights of transgender people, and the outright ban on abortion have led to a large outflow from Texas as well. While Texas was the second most moved to state in the US in 2021, it was also the second most moved out of state as well, trailing behind Florida and California respectively. A war would destabilize Texas to such a point that there would likely be a massive outflow of people, or perhaps a complete breakdown in major city centers, which are both increasingly progressive politically and which increasingly find themselves butting heads with state policy on things such as infrastructure and public services. But let's say Texas somehow avoids a costly war with the US. What then? Well, as is an independent Texas would be the 9th largest economy in the world, with great access to resources, a vast amount of land, and if the government had any interest in doing so, ample space, particularly in the western deserts, for further development of solar and wind projects. Texas would also have to grapple with several issues. Thanks in part to climate change, an increasing amount of food would have to be imported from abroad due to being difficult to grow. Not to mention Texas has an ever-growing need for energy production, and a power grid that fails whenever temperatures reach extreme highs or lows. Texas may also have to grapple with its infrastructure issues. Like much of the US, Texas has both a wide number of bridges and roads in need of repair, I'm not saying that there is absolutely zero chance of Texas succeeding if it secedes. What I'm saying is it likely won't be pretty. Texas has tried to be independent twice before, once on its own and once as part of a different country, and both times it failed. And if it tried again, it'd likely mean war. If Texas somehow avoids being dragged back into the US kicking and screaming, what's to say that in 9 years' time they won't find itself back in the same point that it was in 1845, in debt and in need of another country to bail it out? That being said, the likelihood of it leaving the US in the first place is absolutely slim to none.